So hello, and thanks for joining the webinar. So we're going to be covering road mapping with TOGAF and Archimate and some more, and some extra capital we've thrown into the mix. Before we start that, I just want to go through a few items of housekeeping. So firstly, if you're not already on mute, please, if you could just make sure that your microphone is muted, just to make sure we don't get any crosstalk in the background. If you do have any questions as we go through the slides, then please, by all means, feel free to ask them, put them into the chat window. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to answer. If for any reason we don't answer your question, or we simply run out of time, then what we'll do is we'll take a note of the questions and we'll respond by email. And finally, also, we will post up some contact details at the end, so you can email us if you have any questions about the content of the webinar, or just anything else really relating to the topic, or of course to the ABACUS toolset. So without any further ado, I'll jump into the slides, the presentation. So this webinar is about road mapping with TOGAF and Archimate Plus. Now we've snuck a sneaky little plus sign in the end of the title, really because we're not in the business necessarily of teaching. We're not a training company, and that we don't actually go out and train people on TOGAF and Archimate. We are, as you'll see, we support those two standards in our tool set, but we do a lot of consulting with clients using those standards. And what we've found is that people implementing those standards will use them to do roadmaps, but they also want some extra kind of hints and tips and best practice on top of the standards to actually kind of accelerate their road mapping efforts, and really to kind of get the maximum result out of the investment and time they're making. So what we're going to show you is some of the kind of out-of-the-box road mapping capabilities in those two standards, but also we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about some of the additional best practice that we've learned over the last few years about how to really build effective and compelling roadmaps. And of course, we try and bring that capital as much as possible back into our tool set and back into our consulting activities. So this is the agenda we'll be covering. We'll talk about why road mapping is important, why road mapping matters to EA teams. And then we'll talk about, before we actually get into the road mapping itself, we'll talk about how you can actually get ready, how you can get in a fit shape to start your team on a road mapping journey in the first place. So there are a few foundations you need to lay down before you start your road mapping activity. We'll then look at actually building your roadmaps, and as I say, we'll be looking at road mapping actually within the bounds of the standards, so within TOGAF and within Archimate. But then we're also going to spend a reasonable amount of time looking at additional methods and additional views you can create on top of those standards to really make your roadmaps compelling. We'll be talking about how you can actually demonstrate the value of those roadmaps to your stakeholders. So in other words, how you can build a compelling business and technology case around your roadmaps. And also, as I say, we'll be looking at actually, how some of the tips and tricks into managing your roadmap delivery effort, and basically how you can make that into something which is intrinsically deliverable. As I say, at the end, if we have a little bit of time for questions and answers, then we'll pick up any questions that have gone into the chat window. Otherwise, as I say, you can email us or you can contact us offline. So before we start, let's just give a bit of background to the company if you don't already know us, and to myself. So my name is Ed Granger. My job title is Discipline Specialist. I'm a consultant with Avolution software, and by background, I'm an enterprise architect. So I worked in information and application architecture for about 10 years, primarily in financial services, but also to a limited extent across other industries. And that's really a sort of key point for us. So as a company, we are a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Our core ABACUS product is very well reviewed and well embedded across the world. But really, what's important to us is that we engage with an awful lot of clients across different geographies and across different industry sectors. So we get a fair idea of the kind of activities and the kind of challenges that EA teams are up against globally. And many of those clients are using Archimate, many of them are using TOGAF, but we also know that many of them are extending those standards to try and accelerate their EA initiatives. So it's that best practice exactly that we're going to be bringing back to you in this presentation. So let's start off with looking at why we roadmap in the first place. Because although the roadmap really is the foundational asset for many EA practices, everybody wants to roadmap, like the slide says. So we go out and talk to guys about cloud, we go out and talk to guys about digital or about cybersecurity, but the one thing everybody always asks for is a roadmap. And that's a kind of strange thing if you think about it, because most enterprises have some kind of in-house planning capability, some kind of in-house strategy and change capability. So there must be something that the EA team is providing that these in-house capabilities aren't. And it's often because of these limits of conventional planning that the EA teams get asked to provide roadmaps. So it might be because project-driven change can be very stovepiped, can be very focused on narrow delivery scopes or narrow benefits windows. There may be hidden interdependencies in the architecture that they're not interested in addressing. And as I say, they may take a very short-term view where the architects need to look 5 or even 10 years ahead. But also there's a certain amount of kind of business change that actually comes from outside the business that architects need to think about. So they need to think about things like regulatory deadlines. Now, many of you might be struggling with things like GDPR right now and actually demonstrating compliance to external regulators in that case. But also things like technology end of life, the whole technical debt area. How do we ensure that our enterprises are still on an up-to-date and fit for purpose technology platform? So really there is a planning function beyond the traditional change function, and that's where the architecture roadmap plays. So in this case, the architects are really performing almost a risk assurance function for the enterprise. Now, as I said, there are many different reasons why we might roadmap. So the types of use cases we see most often are things like, reducing application complexity or moving to the cloud, technology replatforming. But really a roadmap can serve any number of business purposes. So it might be responding to a much more, outside in, might be taking a much more customer-centric view of the organization and responding to customer needs. It might be based around risk mitigation. So it might be looking at business risks or security threats, cybersecurity, system vulnerabilities. It may, as I say, in the case of something like GDPR, looking at regulatory compliance. So virtually every industry sector has some kind of regulation that applies to it, and demonstrating compliance with that often requires some kind of change activity, some kind of architecture transformation. Another big ticket item is the kind of traditional mergers and acquisitions activity where you have 2 or more organizations coming together, and you really want to actually look at the transformation of those operating models and minimizing the kind of functional overlaps between those companies. And even in the kind of tech innovation space, road mapping plays a role, often not so much in the actual innovation itself, but in establishing an innovation capability, in giving companies the ability to rapidly formulate and deploy new solutions. So there's really no one reason why people roadmap, but in terms of the methods, they're kind of common across all these use cases. So fundamentally, what is a roadmap? Well, since we're talking about TOGAF and Archimate, let's start with the definition from TOGAF. So a roadmap is an abstracted plan for business and technology change, typically operating across multiple disciplines over multiple years. And it's normally used in the phrases like technology roadmap or architecture roadmap, etc. The key point is there's a planning aspect to a roadmap. So this is what differentiates it from other architecture artifacts. And we'll take a bit of a deeper look at that. So we're good to go. We know what a roadmap is. We know why we're doing it. We're eager to start drawing roadmaps. But this is where we say, stop and think a moment about how you're going to roadmap. We need to actually put some foundations in place before we start our roadmapping journey. So the first thing is, since this, the title of this presentation is with TOGAF and Archimate, well, what about, let's look at standards. Let's look at where the work has already been done in defining how to roadmap. So, I suspect many of you, if you're working in the architecture space, will have looked at these standards. If you haven't, you should, because standards are accelerators. They're things that enable you to get going quickly, and they provide a lot of things. So they provide things like reference model, pre-configured assets you can actually use to shape your architecture and shape your roadmaps. They give you methods, processes for actually putting those roadmaps together. They give you meta models, which will actually organize your architecture content into a form that it can be roadmapped. And of course, in the case of something like Archimate, it gives you templates and actual visual notations for how you should represent those roadmaps. So in Avolution, we're proud to say that ABACUS is certified for TOGAF 9.1. It's certified for Archimate 3.0. I can tell you hot off the press because TOGAF 9.2 has just gone live. We now support 9.2. We're not certified yet, but that's only because the certification process hasn't started yet. So we expect to be certified for the latest release. And of course, we support many, many other standards, including things like BPMN, UML. I'll show you a bit more of those in a moment. But really going back to my original point, one of the key things we find from client engagements, even for people who are using these standards fairly rigorously, is they're using them as a toolbox. They're using them as a grab bag of approaches, but don't be afraid to extend the standards. Don't be afraid to tailor them, because in many cases it's essential that you do, and I'll show you why. So this is just a quick view of the TOGAF 9.2 library. As I say, hot off the press, 9.2 has only been out a few weeks anyway from the open group, but we've already got a configuration that supports it. You can see, for those TOGAF fans amongst you, you can see the familiar architecture development method we call the crop circles, the ADM. And I've also highlighted in here the phases which are particularly relevant to road mapping. So phase E, opportunities and solutions, and phase F, migration planning. Now, those of you who know TOGAF will know that each of these phases has sets of activities and deliverables associated with them, but those two phases in particular are the ones that actually focus on road mapping. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the TOGAF 9.2 meta model, and this, as I say, has been updated for the latest version of the standard and represents all the business, technology, application, and information concepts that you potentially need to roadmap. We also, as I say, support Archimate 3. So this is a view of the various elements that make up Archimate. For those of you who know Archimate, you'll know that the core of it is the business, application, and technology layers. So the three, the yellow, the blue, and the green layers you can see in the center of the picture. But there are a number of other extensions and elements in Archimate which help with things like road mapping and strategy. And a particular relevance to the road mapping use case is the so-called implementation and migration area, which contains a particular set of elements which are specifically designed to help put together roadmaps. And again, we're fully certified for Archimate 3. Now, if you've dived into TOGAF, you'll know that TOGAF has a concept of an architecture repository, and the summary of what the architecture repository is, particularly if, one of the reasons you're listening to this webinar is because you're in the market for an EA tool. An architecture repository really says what the key characteristics of your EA repository should be. And this, for example, is how we at Avolution with ABACUS support the TOGAF architecture repository specifications. So in terms of the architecture meta model, we obviously have the full TOGAF meta model. We support Archimate, but we also support a whole range of other diagramming and modeling standards such as BPMN, UML, we support ITIL, we support PIAF, Object Management Group. We also have our own in-house meta model which combines the best elements from all these other standards. And there are many, many other standards we support. So if you have a particular diagramming and modeling standard you're interested in, check out our website. You may find that we already have it. Now, the next element is actually the reference library. So a key part of the architecture repository is the ability to have architecture reference models. And these can be things like technology models like the TRM, technology reference model from TOGAF, which kind of describe universal IT concepts. But they can also be business models that do things like describe particular industry verticals. So we have some of the ones we support, just a small selection of the ones we support here, but the BIAN, the Banking Industry Architecture Network, that's a banking reference model. APQC is a whole set of business process models which span a whole range of different industry sectors, including things like defense, including things like insurance, including government functions. So you can take a look at that. That's free capital. We also have things like the TM Forum, that's the ETOM, the telecoms reference model. So we have a whole range of business models we can just literally suck into ABACUS straight away, and you can start using them straight away to build your roadmaps. Now, the next element you'll see is a thing called the standards information base. And this is really where we're doing things like taking in technology standards, like database technologies with their end of life dates, or particular programming languages or particular operating systems. So those kind of granular technology standards that we need to map against our architecture. And again, we have multiple sources for that. So we ship ABACUS with a certain number of preloaded standards, but because there's a huge amount of software out there potentially, we also have connectors to things like the Technopedia library. And Technopedia is a vast library of standard technologies which you can automatically import into ABACUS and use to start to map to your architecture to understand where your organization is consuming those standard technologies within its architecture. And we also have templates for things like Amazon Web Services architecture. So if you're doing, for example, architecture in the cloud and you're wanting to use AWS, we have libraries which give you, literally a component for every AWS service currently available, or at least the majority of them. I don't want to be legally binding, but that information does come from Amazon, so we trust them to keep it up to date. And finally, at the bottom left-hand corner, we have the kind of standard views that ABACUS uses to fulfill the architecture repositories. So the first three certainly are referenced in TOGAF, so catalogs, in other words, inventories of information, be they processes or applications, matrices that show the relationships in your architecture, and diagrams. But ABACUS actually takes it further. It actually has a number of artifact types which are not referenced necessarily in the standards. Things like charts for showing metrics and KPIs, 3D views, and reports and dashboards. And I'll talk a bit about those later. So the question we always get asked, particularly by those not using the EA tool, is why can't I do all this using MS Office? And I'm not here to throw rocks at Office, because we all know it and we all love it, or at least most of the time. But it's not the best tool for building an architecture in. Fundamentally because, when you start putting an architecture together, you are going to be challenged on that architecture, both in terms of the content of it and in terms of the actual, where it's the right architecture, but also, whether you have an understanding of things like its business value or its technical value. So you need it to be credible. So you need your architecture to be fact-based. So it has to be based on real data. It also needs to be consistent. So a key challenge for architecture teams is when they're putting out all these architecture artifacts, if they're putting out data artifacts and technology and infrastructure artifacts, business artifacts, is actually demonstrating the alignment between all those different architectures and all those different strategies they're coming up with. Very, very difficult to do when you're just working off documents. And of course, they need to be kept up to date. So we all know that, as soon as something is published, it's out of date, or at least it starts to get out of date. You have to have a mechanism for keeping this architecture capital current, because as soon as it falls behind the change curve, then, as an architecture team, you start to lose some authority. So really, this need for a kind of automation, the need to be able to query the architecture as you would a database, the need to be able to reconcile the different views and integrate the different views, it's driving teams more and more towards a data-driven approach. And that fundamentally means an EA tool, because at the heart of an EA tool is a database or an integrated data set, which represents the totality, the integrated totality of the architectures. So you have to make sure that the EA tooling is fit for purpose. And if you'd like to know more about ABACUS, we would be delighted to talk to you. You also have to bear in mind that when you start road mapping, a lot of the information you're going to need actually exists in other parts of the organization. And so you've got to harvest that information in and then manage it as a shared asset. So the first thing we say is don't reinvent the wheel. If you have a CMDB with all your applications in, go and grab it. If you have a PPM tool with all your projects in, go and grab it. Bring as much of that existing capital into your architecture as you can. But to do that, obviously, you need efficient integration. And ABACUS has a range of different integration options, including, right from the very basic, like Excel spreadsheets and CSV files, right up to REST APIs and everything in between. So we have a whole range of ways to go and harvest that rich content from your organization. Right, enough of the sales talk. Let's talk about actually building the roadmaps. So it's a good thing to do is to look at, the definition of roadmaps, both in TOGAF and Archimate. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but just really to give you a flavor of what they are. So as I said, if you want to look at TOGAF, look at those 2 steps of the ADM, opportunities and solutions, and migration planning. If you want to look at Archimate, you can look at the standards there. They're both published online. But just to give you an idea of what a roadmap looks like in TOGAF, one of the first things to understand about TOGAF is a roadmap necessarily isn't just one picture, it's actually a collection of assets. So you're typically going to have a collection of work packages. Now these are basically units of activity that need to be completed to actually get from one point to another. And I'll talk a bit more about work packages in a moment. You may have, for each work package, you may have a context diagram describing what the architecture change is going to be. You may put together a portfolio of bubble charts. So we have a lovely thing called a business footprint matrix here, which basically shows the planned activities by their organizational risk and their organizational value. And that's a way basically to prioritize the architecture activity you're looking at undertaking. You may put date properties on components. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. But fundamentally, all these things are going to roll up into your first cut of the TOGAF implementation and migration plan. And this is really your master document for saying how you're going to migrate from one architecture state to another, from your baseline to your target. But the point is, fundamentally, that is a document. It's not necessarily a picture. So often people want something to wave under somebody's nose to actually show in visual terms how we're going to migrate from A to B. And Archimate supports this. So Archimate is, unlike TOGAF, which is more kind of method-based, Archimate is purely a modeling notation. So it's a visual notation for representing the architecture. And it has in particular a thing called the implementation and migration viewpoint. Now, this is basically a way of visually modeling your roadmap. So you see there are a number of different boxes, colors, and shapes on there. At the bottom, we have the red shapes. So the red squares, the red rectangles at the bottom are what we call work packages. And these are really the bits of activity that can drive us from one state to another. And the document shapes above them, the red document shapes, are deliverables. These are the actual things you're going to produce from doing that work package, such as a data architecture or a big data architecture or an architecture for process automation. These are the architecture deliverables that are going to drop out of each of those activities. Now in the middle, in the blue layer, you can see the actual the architecture components we're going to put in place. So for example, a real-time analytics platform or a Hadoop platform. And the green shapes at the top really represent the states of the architecture. So we have, these things are called plateaus. And the boxes are plateaus. You can see we have a baseline architecture, we have a transition architecture, and we have a target architecture. And you can see that different of those architecture components are associated with different plateaus, meaning basically these things will be operational at that point in time. And at the top, the green page symbols you can see, these are gaps. These are basically the differences between those plateaus that need to be addressed by the architecture description. So fundamentally, these are what's missing from the architecture that, against the requirement that you're going to need to, the gaps you need to plug at each point. So the point about Archimate, though, is it's a standard notation. You have one notation, across every domain of architecture where you're doing data architecture, application architecture, technology architecture, whatever. You're going to be using the same shapes, the same colors. Now, what we do find, the problem with that is, and it's not a problem per se, it's just it's a limitation of working with a standard, is that often when you're actually building a roadmap, you're actually facing off to non-architects. It sounds obvious, but it's absolutely true. You're facing off, in many cases, to technical stakeholders who nevertheless aren't architects, but also often to business stakeholders or high-level technical stakeholders who aren't actually that technical. And a key part of doing architecture is telling stories. So one of the reasons we would say you should, can consider departing from a standard, or at least building additional viewpoints on top of a standard, is to make the messaging more meaningful to your audience. So to make sure that your audience understand what we're doing and why we're doing that. And that could be, we might need to provide very detailed specification, type of views to very low-level technical stakeholders, for example, like solution designers or even developers who are actually going to build these things. Or we might need to tell our high-level business story to a business stakeholder to persuade them to fund a piece of activity. So that's really what we're going to show you in the next section. So we need to think about what the fundamental elements of a roadmap are. And basically, fundamentally a roadmap consists of a few very basic parts. Firstly, we need an articulation of where we are. And in TOGAF terms, this is our baseline architecture. We need an articulation of where we're trying to get to. So, it's a roadmap, we need a direction of travel. So basically, we need to say, we're trying to go over here. We're trying to implement these things or build these things. But we also need to be able to say why we're trying to do that. We need to articulate in technical and business terms the rationale why that's the right direction to go in. And finally, we need to say how we're going to get there. And this can be our work packages, our activities, this can be our transition architectures, but we need to actually say what the route is to go from A to B, because it may not be a straight line. So we fundamentally have 4 styles of roadmaps that we see above and beyond the basic kind of TOGAF and Archimate standards. And basically each has a different level of sophistication. Each is kind of tailored for a different audience, but also they're kind of increasing levels of maturity and increasing levels of data population. So you might find that you can start off doing one style, and then over time you can do 3 or 4 styles as you build up your information content. But actually, we're not saying choose one. What we're saying is here's a whole range of styles you can use, and you should mesh these styles or fit these styles to your stakeholders. So the first style, what we call a type 1 roadmap, is basically simply where we're heat mapping the elements of our architecture, basically with whether we want to take them forward or not. So basically what we have is, for example, here like a business function model. We have a series of high-level business functions or capabilities, and we're simply marking them red or green or amber by whether we want to invest in them, by whether we want to deprecate them or retire them, or by whether we want to just kind of keep them in a steady state. So don't underestimate just how powerful this kind of view can be, even though it's very simple, because it provides immediate clarity of where people should be committing their resources, where they should be investing, or potentially where they should be investing to decommission something. So how do you actually come up with those ratings? So basically what we're doing is, for each application or each function or each process, we're giving it some kind of rating to say good, bad, indifferent. And there are a number of different methods for doing this. So many of you will have come across the time rating, which stands for tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate, or the 4 Rs, retain, redesign, refresh, retire. Basically, we're giving each element in that portfolio of things, for example, applications, one of these ratings. So we want to tolerate application A, invest in application B, eliminate application C. Now, we can do this in a very subjective way. We can just literally get a bunch of experienced technology guys and business guys in a room and say, what do you think of this application? Or we can use a much more data-driven approach. And one of the things that we do in Avolution is we actually offer an algorithm, an APM algorithm, that will do the calculation for you based on some common criteria. And it will do it basically by defining what the business fit and the technical fit of each of those applications is. So something that's high business fit and high technical fit is likely to be an invest application. And something that's low business fit and low technical fit is very likely to be eliminate. And there's a bit of science to basically how you map the ratings to the business fit and technical fit. But it's a very much a data-driven methodology. Now, as you can see from the slide, there are many, many different ways you can represent this kind of heat mapping, but basically they're all using color. They're all using fundamentally a red, yellow, green, red, amber, green color scheme to kind of dictate what's good and what's not so good. And as I say, it's very simple, and actually its simplicity is its great virtue. It can be understood very easily by a non-technical audience. We also have some products which will actually make these roadmaps interactive. So we can actually use data visualizations. I'm not going to demo it here, but you can see some screenshots. These, things like tree maps, the large rectangular visualization. You can drill into each area. You can see, for example, which applications are strategic and which ones are not. They can be sized by cost. As you drill into each area, they'll expand down. So they actually allow people to explore the data, allow you to present out a very large volume of information in a way that's intuitive and easy for non-technical stakeholders to navigate. The next main category we have are lifecycle and Gantt chart type roadmaps. So this is where fundamentally we're bringing in a view of time. So what those heat maps don't do is they don't give us a view of when things are happening. They show us, fundamentally what we like and what we don't like, but they don't say, okay, this application is going to be with us for another 2 years or 3 years. On the flip side, we have the good old Microsoft Project Gantt chart. It shows you when activities are happening, but they don't necessarily apply those timelines to the actual architecture itself. So we might know the project is executing in this time scale, but we don't know when the application itself will necessarily be retired. So to bridge those two views, we kind of need to apply that time-based view to our architecture itself. And we do this in the form of life cycles. Now, a life cycle is simply a set of properties you apply to any element, like a process or a server or a particular technology or an application, that basically says, what its key life stages are. And at the very minimum, it has 2. It has the date in which it comes into existence and the date in which it goes out of existence. So it's a from date and a to date, the date in which it's born, the date in which it dies. You can have more sophisticated life cycles. But also something else to consider is that there are some life cycles that you yourself as an organization are in control of. So you can dictate when this process will change, or when this project will execute, or when this application will be updated. But there are also things like regulatory deadlines and technology end of life dates, which you have no control over at all. So you need to bear in mind the fact that some of that lifecycle data will effectively come from external sources. It will come from outside the organization, and you have to manage it, but you don't necessarily have any control over it. Now, what you can see at the graphic at the bottom are three applications, two of which have very simple life cycles. So application A, we've simply said that it starts in year 1, it finishes in year 7. Application B starts in year 8 and ends in year 10. So we have a very simple from and to dates. But application C has a much more sophisticated life cycle. It actually has discrete evaluation, development, deployment, run, growth, maintenance, migration, archive, and decommission phases. And the real advantage of using more granular life cycles, and each of these is just a date we're going to put against the application. The advantage of doing this is we can actually adapt our governance and our architecture strategy to each of those phases. So we can invest in the growth phase, we might invest in the migration phase, but only investment that will actually allow that migration. So we're not going to put any more new processing or new business onto that application in the migration phase. So we can take a very nuanced, very controlled view of what our approach should be based on the lifecycle phase it's in. Now we can use those life cycles then to understand dependencies in our architectures. So we can see, for example, if an application is due to be retired, it obviously has to be replaced by another application. And if that application isn't commissioned in time, then we can't retire the first application. So we can actually start to look at the life cycles between elements and identify timing mismatches, understand places where fundamentally we need to change the schedule, we need to extend the lifetime of something or bring the implementation of something further in. And so for example, we offer roadmap reports that make this clear. We also offer reports that will show things like the timing mismatches. So you can see, for example, where this kind of mismatch between, for example, an application and its replacement, you can see, and the report will actually highlight where there's a gap. Something else we can do, because ABACUS is based on a graph database, very clever bit of technology that basically makes it very easy to understand the relationships in your architecture, is that we can understand the linked life cycles across many different dimensions of the architecture. So we talked before about the fact that the architecture is made up of business layers, application layers, information layers, technology layers. We can actually, for example, for a given application, we understand the end-to-end ecosystem it plays in. So we understand, for example, that it interfaces with other applications, that it supports particular processors or business products, that it sits on particular technology platforms. So the graph database allows us to understand those interdependencies and then to look at those life cycles all on one page. So this is an example of what we call a multi-dimensional roadmap. And we have, for any given application, we have not only its life cycle, when it's commissioned, when it's in test, for example, when it's being decommissioned, but also the life cycles of the technologies it's sitting on, the life cycles of the applications it's interfacing with, and of course the life cycle of any applications that are going to replace it. So we can start to manage these multiple life cycles and understand where they impact each other. For example, if the application is going to be around for the next 20 years, but its database technology is out of support next year, we're going to need to think about replatforming. So life cycles are tremendously useful and tremendously powerful, and they're also a very intuitive way of understanding roadmaps. But what they don't do is actually tell you how we're going to get from A to B. So they say when we're going to do stuff, they don't necessarily tell us how we're going to do this. To do this, we need to go back to the TOGAF and the ArchiMate concept of work packages. Now, TOGAF defines a work package as a set of actions which is identified to achieve one or more objectives for the business. A work package can be part of a project, a complete project, or a program. Fundamentally, a work package is just a set of activities. It doesn't really have a given size or scope. It's just, a set of things you need to execute on to transform your architecture or to migrate your architecture. The Archimate viewpoint will actually show you those work packages and show you, their relationships to the architecture elements the implementation and migration viewpoint. we'll show the elements and we'll show the various plateaus. So those work packages are explicitly modeled using the Archimate standard, but that's not the only way we can actually represent them, because one of the advantages of having an EA tool is the elements you actually see on the page, on the picture, can also be represented in other views. So we can represent them as a set of, effectively in a catalog, as a set of candidate projects or project activities. And we can also do things like understand the relationships with the wider architecture using things like matrices. So we can understand, for example, where one set of work packages, one set of projects might actually, impact multiple applications, or we might have, two or more projects impacting the same application at the same time, which is a fairly common problem in large organizations. So we can start to then harmonize our project portfolio by understanding where the crossover is and where the collisions are, and where the opportunities to actually rationalize or share resources more effectively lie. The fourth and most exotic style of roadmap is what we call a multiple architectures roadmap. And so fundamentally, so far, we've kind of modeled our journey from baseline to target via transition architectures, all by adding properties to things within a single architecture. So we have an application, we've added a strategic rating, for example, like a time rating or a 4 hours rating, or we've added lifecycle properties, or we've connected it to a work package. Now, TOGAF obviously talks about baseline, target, and transition architectures. We can, within ABACUS, for example, actually model these as entirely discrete architectures of different workspaces, effectively different cuts of the architecture. And there are some advantages to doing this, and there are some disadvantages to doing this. One of the disadvantages, obviously, is you have a lot more architecture to manage. You have many architectures. You can see from the graphic on the right, we have historical architectures, which represent where we were. We have current architectures, which represent where we are now. We have staging architectures, which represent where we're going to nearly, so the stuff that we're just about to implement. And we have the kind of more future, the more project-based architectures, which say basically what's in build at the moment. So in this case, basically, those architectures, as well as the work packages, become the foundation for your implementation and migration plan. But one of the advantages of the multiple architecture method is that they enable us to model scenarios. So sometimes it's not obvious, when you're putting together your roadmaps, actually what the business strategy is. Or maybe the business strategy is so fast changing because the market is fast changing that you actually need to have multiple different scenarios you can model to say, well, if we're going over here, then this is the right architecture. But if we're going over here, then this is the right architecture. So you can see on the right-hand side, we have a couple of graphics which represent basically the kind of the views of our multiple architectures, where we have at the top, we have a historic architecture, we have a current architecture, and we have 3 scenarios. And each of these are rated against 2 performance criteria: availability or reliability or service. In other words, how, for example, these are applications, what their uptime is, versus performance, which is scalability, the ability to actually process new volumes of data or business. So we have some which are kind of optimized for availability, we have some which are optimized for performance, we have some which kind of fall in between. And likewise, we can actually, at the bottom, we can actually use multiple architectures to represent different routes to the same endpoint. So you see the kind of green route and the red route, both of them are taking kind of different routes between value for money and health outcomes. In this case, it was done for a healthcare provider. Now they get to pretty much the same space, but the point is each of these, what are in effect transition architectures, are implementing a set of capabilities, in the meantime, which are giving different sets of benefits. So they're realizing different sets of benefits at different points in time. So scenarios are quite powerful in terms of demonstrating how we can realize architecture benefits. But they do, imply a much higher level of kind of architecture capability if you're going to be modeling your architecture and analyzing it multiple times. So we talked about analyzing it. We talked about, how we demonstrate some benefits. We actually need to talk a little bit about this because, to be honest, there's very little guidance out there in the market about exactly how you tell a kind of performance or a business performance or a technical performance-based story around your roadmaps. So it's very important that we actually can say why we're wanting to migrate from one place to another. We tend to often, I think, a trap I've fallen into as an architect, a trap many architects fall into, is that we assume the benefits are kind of self-evident. So, for example, you know, the CEO shouts at the CIO because the IT isn't reliable enough, the service is too poor. So we then map out what the current architecture looks like, and then we have a roadmap that will take us to a target architecture, and we take that back and say, this is our target architecture, and then they say, well, how's that going to improve service? Because all they're seeing is a bunch of boxes and lines on the page. It's not obvious how you can actually demonstrate the benefit of that target architecture. So we have to be able to actually measure those architectures for performance, and we have to demonstrate how they're getting closer to the business objectives. Now, TOGAF has some good guidance on this as part of the architecture continuum section of the standard, and it talks about capability-based planning. And this is one of the key approaches we've found very effective in actually telling business stories around roadmaps. Now, what a capability is, it's basically, you know, it's a set of high-level requirements, but fundamentally they're focusing on top-down business outcomes. So a capability is a very broad, a very top-down, a very business-focused view. It's taking a corporate view of the organization rather than necessarily a line of business perspective. And TOGAF talks about incremental benefits, talks about capability increments that deliver continuous value. So as you move through that roadmap, you're not having to wait 5 years before the business see any value. They're seeing incremental value each time you're delivering an increment, each time you're delivering effectively a transition architecture. And so we can actually measure these increments and actually, you know, compare them for the value they're providing on a number of different dimensions. So again, another TOGAF artifact at the bottom of the left-hand bottom of the page is a thing called the capability increment radar, and it shows basically for each drop of functionality what the business value is, getting bigger and bigger and bigger on multiple dimensions all the time. But the question really is for us as architects, well, that's good, but what actually are we measuring here? What, you know, how are we actually demonstrating that value? So the kind of ways that we find most effective in measuring value of a roadmap is to be able to tell a series of effectively stories around the financials and the non-functional measures. So we need to be able to say, you know, financially or in terms of non-functionals, how the end state of the roadmap or even how intermediate states are improving the business performance. So we might be looking at financial measures. So for example, you know, our applications currently cost X, in the future they'll cost Y. Or performance measures, you know, our infrastructure can currently process this much information, in the future we'll be able to process 3 times as much information. Reliability or service, it's a key one for all IT organizations. You know, what's the uptime of what's the reliability, the availability of our IT going to be, particularly as we move towards, you know, we're already in a 24/7, you know, world. Agility, again, agile is huge, but can we actually measure how this architecture will be more agile, will enable us to actually respond to bring new products and services to market faster? Can we demonstrate how it's going to lower risk? And a kind of general measure we find very useful is, can we actually just show how we're going to tackle this complexity? You know, whether it's business process complexity or application integrations complexity, or just, you know, huge technology diversity. How can we show how we're going to simplify our organization? So we can measure all these things because they are properties we can put on our applications or on our processes. And the lifecycle properties we talked about earlier, they will actually show when these measures are going to change. So basically, as applications become decommissioned or processes go on stream or new technology is commissioned, that will make a difference to the cost, or will make a difference to the reliability, or will make a difference to the risk. So as our roadmaps progress, we can actually show the progression of these metrics as well. And in that way, we can actually also think about charts as being roadmaps in themselves. So for example, we have a 5-year cost projection for capabilities from ABACUS at the bottom. Now we actually use quite sophisticated cost algorithms to calculate those costs. We have a whole cost methodology, as we do for things like reliability and complexity. But we can actually tell in business metrics how, you know, the strategy is going to move the needle more towards those corporate objectives. And although we don't intuitively think as charts, as roadmaps, as architects, often these are actually far more business meaningful for senior stakeholders than a sort of traditional roadmap that looks like a Gantt chart or looks like, you know, a systems landscape. The final real consideration is, you know, how we actually model the delivery of these roadmaps. Now, chances are, even if you've got all the theory, and even if you've got all the tech, and even if you've swatted up on the standards, this is still going to be quite a daunting piece of work. Particularly if you're a new architecture practice, you've just started actually building your roadmaps, or just started trying to discover how to build roadmaps. You may have a team which consists of many different disciplines of architects. So you may have a business architect or business architects. You may have application architects, infrastructure architects, technology architects, security architects, digital architects, you name it. And if you work in an organization of any size, you may have hundreds, thousands of processes. Likewise, applications, huge numbers of different technologies. The sheer scale of trying to do a road mapping exercise, of any scope, unless you're looking, if you're looking within a project scope, it's not too bad. If you're looking at an enterprise scale, it's quite intimidating. So how do we actually manage that huge explosion of content? Well, as the old joke goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You have to find a way to actually chunk up your architecture into manageable chunks, to make it a scale that you can actually manage as an architecture team or an architecture community. And again, TOGAF has some useful advice around here, particularly in the space of what it calls architecture partitioning or architecture partitions. Architecture partitions are basically a way of dividing up the architecture into manageable chunks, so you can actually start to build those roadmaps and build those stories. And the reason we partition architectures, well, is multiple, really. For example, we may have different organizational units that conflict with each other, and they may need to conflict with each other. So there may actually be a legitimate case why the architecture for one org unit looks different from the architecture for another org unit. It might be that one is optimized for cost, one is optimized for scale. There are legitimate reasons to have kind of different speed architecture within a business. We also, as I said, we're going to have many different types of architects working on these roadmaps. So we'll have, different architects working on the roadmap at the same time. You may have your infrastructure guys working on a cloud migration strategy. At the same time, your application integration guys are working on an API strategy. At the same time, your business architects are working on a BPO strategy. And you've got all these different moving parts. You've got to actually reconcile them somehow, but also you have to chunk up the architecture. So each of those strategies can be worked on in isolation and concurrently. You don't want to have to tell your business guys, well, you have to wait till the application guys are finished, and the application guys are going to wait till the infrastructure guys are finished before you can even start, because all that will happen is they'll go off and do it anyway, and it will become disconnected from the rest of the strategy. Finally, architecture needs to be modular. So it should be, componentization should be a principle familiar and hopefully dear to the hearts of most architects. But we need to chunk the architecture up into reusable architecture segments. And those segments can then be reused into the broader architecture, but they need to be worked on potentially in isolation. So all these are reasons why we potentially need to partition and divide up our architecture. So how do we go about doing it? Well, again, we look at TOGAF, and TOGAF has some good guidance on partitioning. There's a lot more than I've got space to present in this pack here. But fundamentally what TOGAF says is you need to think of your architecture at different levels, and TOGAF defines 3 fundamental levels. The strategic level, which is basically where you're facing off to your very high level business stakeholders. And then we have the segment level, which is when we might be looking at an individual line of business or an individual capability or an individual geography, for example, a different region. So we're then looking at a kind of mid-level segmentation or partitioning. And then we get right down to the granular, to the capability architectures. This is where we might be looking at individual capability and an individual business or technical capability. We're actually got a specific focus on a specific bit of functionality. So that's the first kind of dimension. We're looking at different levels, and then really, those 3 fundamental kind of I was going to say levels. I'm using the word too much, but those 3 fundamental kind of categories are then chunked up by 4 dimensions. So first is breadth. So what level of scope are you going to in this architecture coverage? Now, if you're talking to the CFO or the COO or even the CEO, you're probably going to want to talk about the whole organization. You'll be wanting to talk about the whole enterprise at once. So basically your scope is very, very broad. Now, if you write down at the capability architecture level, you're potentially looking at a very focused area. You're looking at a particular bit of function, maybe a particular bit of technology function, or a particular bit of business functionality or business activity. So you're much more granular. So we're not looking necessarily at the entire enterprise at that point. We've trimmed it right down to a specific focus. And of course, the segment architecture falls somewhere in between. So again, an example might be, we're not looking at the whole enterprise, we're looking at a particular line of business, or we're just looking at, the US operation or the Malaysian operation or whatever. So the next dimension is depth. This is really the level of detail you're going to go down to. And, to use a kind of analogy, if you're doing an application architecture, there'll be a level which just have big boxes on the page, and these are your major apps. These are just the big chunky things that even, the CEO will have heard of. But you might go right down to a very granular level equally. You might go right down to the level of, an individual app, the individual subcomponents of an app, the subcomponents of the subcomponents. You might be getting to doing things like UML interaction diagrams. You might be well and truly into kind of solution specification space. So really, again, choose the level of detail that's going to be appropriate to your audience. And so there's a strong correlation between kind of breadth and depth. So typically, if you're talking enterprise breadth, you're talking very high level, very summarized information. And that's not just big boxes. Remember, it might also be metrics. Your CEO might actually just want to see the measures that the architecture is going to deliver, not necessarily have any view of boxes at all. The next one is time. Really, this is the planning horizon. How far ahead in the future are you looking? So are you planning 5 years in advance? Are you planning 5 months in advance? Are you planning 5 weeks in advance? If it's 5 days in advance, it's probably not enough, but nonetheless, each of these kind of views has a different planning horizon. And you can see from the graphic, for example, at the enterprise level, you tend to be talking long-term plans. You're talking very wide, you're talking very high level, but you're also saying, fundamentally, this is where my business or this is where my organization wants to be, in the strategic sense over a reasonable time scale. If you're at the segment level, well, you might be looking at, individual planning cycles. You might be looking at the next year or the next 2 years. Certainly, you're going to want to be telling a much shorter term story. And if you're right down at the capability level, particularly if you're doing those, those transition architectures or those capability increments, you might be talking quarter by quarter, or even month by month, although that's probably a little short. But fundamentally, your planning horizon is, again, very closely correlated to the level of detail you're operating at and the breadth you're operating at. And the final dimension really is what we call here recency, or the rate of refresh. Basically, the more granular you get, the faster things change. So at the strategic level, the organization might be a relatively slowly evolving beast. Down at the capability level, it's happening quite quickly. Things are changing all the time. So you need to keep those assets up to date. So when we're looking at the EA tool, it's got to do a couple of things. It's got to actually be able to represent all these different viewpoints, and so you've got to be able to provide that high level view, your architecture vision, the enterprise level roadmap, right down to the capability level roadmap. So it's got to be able to represent those different views and do them consistently, because what you do not want to do is, when you're partitioning, is to actually, introduce disjoints or introduce disconnects into your architecture. Certainly when you're looking at things like the refresh rate, then something that's very useful is that if you can automate part or all of the road mapping activity. So one thing we do a lot in ABACUS is we actually automate both the ingestion of the data. So we'll scoop data in using automated load processes or APIs from other tools. But we'll also automate the generation of the roadmaps themselves. And this is a very effective way of ensuring that the EA team can stay on top of demand, because if you can refresh your roadmaps every day, which is way faster than, particularly if you've got hundreds of roadmaps, you can refresh them every day. That basically means that you will be on top of change so long as the data is kept up to date. Whereas if you're having to do it by hand in PowerPoint or Visio, that's going to be a much slower process. But finally, also, you've got to be able to, having partitioned the architecture, you've got to be able to reintegrate it. So we don't want to partition it so much that we can't then put the pieces back together again. So one of the really powerful things about an EA tool is the ability to basically partition virtually, so you have different views, use things like accesses and permissions to actually create different workspaces, but you don't lose the underlying integration and connectivity. So when you do need to compose those views back together again and show the traceability right from the enterprise level right down to the granular capability level, you can support that. And you can support it across a user base, which is likely to be wanting to work on these things concurrently. and also is likely to be geographically distributed. So your architects might sit in many different places across the globe or across your particular region. So that's all quite challenging from an information management point of view, and that is exactly why EA tools are based around, a fundamentally an integrated data set behind the scenes. So we're down to the last 5 minutes. We'll have a very short amount of time for questions if we have any, but the takeaways I really want to leave you with are, firstly, think about investing in a road mapping platform. Seriously think about it. If you're going into if you're a new EA team, you're going into a road mapping initiative, then think about the actual technology and the processes you're going to need to wrap around those roadmaps, beyond just giving everybody a task to do a roadmap and having maybe a shared drive or a SharePoint site to keep them in. That will come unstuck very quickly. Secondly, the question is, how do I roadmap? Well, your first port of call should be the standards. Look at TOGAF, look at ArchiMate, sit down, really understand them, and make sure you do understand them, because a lot of clever people have put a lot of thought and a lot of time in defining exactly how those standards work, and they've been run through, of course, countless companies over the last X years. But, and we can say this because we don't offer, as I say, TOGAF or ArchiMate training, don't be afraid to then start to riff on them in the musical terms. Don't be afraid to start to adapt them. Don't be afraid to build different views on top of them. Because the most fundamental thing is that you fundamentally can reach out to your stakeholders. Demonstrate business values and capabilities. So think about the metrics you want to measure and use a capability approach to actually measure them. And finally, understand architecture partitioning. So understand how to segment up this architecture in a way that enables it to be delivered, in a concurrent way. So it enables you to produce different views for different levels and in different architecture disciplines, but also to reintegrate it at the end. Just a quick call out, we now support TOGAF 9.2, so that's fresh out of the gate. You guys know already that we support ArchiMate, so if you're interested in TOGAF, ArchiMate, or just EA in general, please feel free to get in touch. And if you do want to email me, then this is my address, edgranger@avolutionsoftware.com. You can also take a look at our homepage, www.avolutionsoftware.com. There's a whole bunch of stuff on there. If you want to give Abacus a try, you can download a free trial and just have a play with it. We've got a YouTube channel, so you can actually see some of the architecture in action. And, so reach out to us if you're interested. And if you want to try the software, then by all means do. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it useful. And that will end the webinar.